Today we are continuing our journey in progressive Christianity. I did a long introduction and welcome last night, so it's going to be shorter today, but I did just want to remind you the topics today. This morning, the underground church, reclaiming the subversive way of Jesus, and we're delighted to be joined by the Reverend Rhonda White, who is going to be from United Theological College, who's going to be a respondent after the presentation. And this afternoon, God Talk, Reuniting Science and Religion, and the respondent, also from UTC, is Dr. Anthony Rees. So Anthony and Rhonda, we are delighted that you are joining us today too. Pitt Street's had a strong tradition of being a progressive church, and last night both Robin and I emphasised that being progressive is not just a matter of thinking the right things. It's a matter of our heads, but it's also a matter of our hearts, our spirituality, and our hands, our action for justice. And so we're delighted that Robin is joining us today because he embodies that connection between head, heart, and hands as a person who is a scholar and teacher, but also a working pastor. Robin is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and Distinguished Professor of Social Justice at Oklahoma City University. He's been the minister of his congregation at Mayflower Congregational for about 30 years. He was born in Oklahoma and grew up in Wichita, Kansas, so he's sharing with us a glimpse of US life that is perhaps different than many of us have experienced. He's the author of 7 wonderful books, and the most recent 3 being Saving Jesus from the Church, The Underground Church, Reclaiming the Subversive Way of Jesus, and Spiritual Defiance, Building a Beloved Community of Resistance. Of great interest to many of us is that Robin is a fellow of the Jesus Seminar and a member of the board of directors of the Westar Institute and a new member of the God Seminar, which he spoke a little bit about last night. Robin is married to Sean Myers, and who is an Oklahoma artist and university professor who's off visiting the Blue Mountains today because she's heard Robin once or twice before, apparently. But Robin, we are delighted to have you with us. I really enjoyed last night and look forward to your presentation now about the Underground Church.
Well, good morning. Beautiful, beautiful morning in the city, and I am again grateful to all of you who took time out of your day to listen to me. It's a remarkable thing to come and listen to a stranger talk and to trust that he has something worth listening to. So I am grateful. And I'm going to begin immediately with the sort of words that begin the prologue of my book, The Underground Church, and here they are. First, the bad news. The Church of Jesus Christ in the Western world's in terrible shape. Mainline churches are dying on the vine. Cathedrals in Europe have become museums. A whole generation has written off the church as hypocritical and obsolete. The Catholic Church has been shaken to the core by widespread sexual abuse of children by priests and wounded itself even more deeply by covering up the crimes. Organized religion in our time is reeling from a lack of credibility. Yet humanity's spiritual impulse remains. It is hardwired into our brains as we seek transcendence in the midst of impermanence. Millions now call themselves spiritual but not religious because they no longer trust the church as an institution. In fact, the very definition of the word faith itself is in crisis. The faithful are not so faithful anymore. They suffer from what the French philosophers called la douleur de votre clément, the pain of seeing too clearly. Now, there are many reasons why people still go to church, of course. There's the power of social convention. There's childhood guilt. There's the need to associate with like-minded people. And even the deep and irrepressible feeling that life must be about something more than private ambition sustained by self-medication. Don't we need to go someplace where we can escape all the small talk about celebrities and sports and who gets voted off the island? We know that human beings need communities. But in all honesty, we have to admit that many, many people head off to church on Sunday morning expecting very little but to bear the cross of boredom. They know that on Sunday morning they will listen to too many announcements. They will hear a sermon that might help them cope, but often seems safely disconnected from the real world, and they will hear music that they would never listen to in their car, much less crank up really loud and sing along to. As churches wither on the vine, they often try to save themselves by just rearranging elements of worship without realizing that nothing on the surface of church can compensate for the deeper identity crisis that leaves us all wondering what church is really about to begin with. And this will sound harsh, but I suspect, after all these years as a pastor, that too few people really expect anything important, much less dangerous, to happen in church. We expect nice things to happen, but not subversive things. Nobody looks over their shoulder these days on their way to church to see if they're being followed. Nobody passes around sermons in sealed brown envelopes to keep them out of the hands of, these are American references, the CIA, the FBI, or the Department of Homeland Security. Christians are not on anyone's no-fly list. Subversive is the last word that comes to mind when someone mentions the church. Fred Craddock, my preaching professor in seminaries, told a little story in class one day I've never forgotten. He would just be lecturing and then just break into a story, and we had no idea what it meant until it soaked in. He said this: "Some time ago I was out in the yard and I saw a sparrow walking down the street. I took a second look because, well, the sparrow appeared to weigh about 9 pounds. I said, 'What are you doing walking?' He said, 'Well, I'm trying to get some of this weight off.' I said, 'Well, I did notice you're kind of heavy. Why don't you fly?' He said, 'Fly?' I said, 'Yeah, why don't you fly?' He said, 'Are you crazy? I've never flown before.' I said, 'Really? You're a bird and you don't fly? What's your name?' And the 9-pound sparrow said, 'My name is Church.'" After 35 years of ordained ministry, I know exactly what Craddock meant when he described the church as a 9-pound sparrow that is afraid to fly. Most congregations today are both fearful and allergic to risk, so much so, in fact, that they're afraid to do the very things that might make them relevant again. In the underground church, the question I pose is simple, but for me it is compelling. How did we get this way when clearly we did not start out this way? It used to be a very radical, very countercultural, very dangerous thing to be a Christian. So to return to our analogy of the sparrow who clipped the wings on what was once a white dove, who domesticated what the first Jesus people called the way, until it became what Harvey Cox called a compliant acolyte of the kingdom, the empire. How did this beloved community that brought so much joy to people who'd never known it before turn into a sort of joyless and often fearful defender of the status quo? I have come to believe that what diminished the power of the church was that it so quickly sort of devolved from a way of life and love into a belief system that satisfies our desire to be right without making any of us, no matter how doctrinally sound, into better human beings. Once we were non-compliant communities that threatened the Roman Empire. Now we are completely absorbed into an empire of our own. Now, the underground church has a signature text, and I grew up learning this in church, and I thought it was perhaps one of the most harmless things Jesus ever said in the Bible. Heaven's imperial rule is like leaven that a woman took and concealed in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. I know, not very exciting, right? I mean, it sounds harmless. I think if you're like me, you learned this in Sunday school and thought, well, it's perfect for a sort of a meeting of the Ladies' Guild, something about making bread. But did you know that this is the only utterance of Jesus in the New Testament to have received all red votes by the Jesus Seminar, meaning they were more certain that this was an authentic utterance of the historical Jesus than any other? So, this one-liner or similitude, comparing what most commonly translates kingdom of God with a woman making bread, that is thought to be Jesus of Nazareth at his most subversive. You've got to be kidding. I again learned this little ditty together with the story of the mustard seed. Remember that? I thought it was a no-brainer, sort of obvious enough for the average third grader. Out of humble, even hidden origins can grow great and powerful things, which we all knew in Sunday school was just a metaphor for the church. We started off small, then we grew into something great, just like the mustard seed grows into a great shrub and then in Matthew miraculously into a tree. Likewise, a pinch of yeast causes a large amount of bread to rise. This is lovely. That's all, just lovely. But like so much of the gospel now buried beneath layers of uncritical sentimentality, the true meaning of this little parable has been lost across a chasm of time, language, culture, and what John Dominic Crossan calls the drag of normalcy. This text occurs in both the Gospel of Thomas and is also, scholars believe, in Q, which means that it's independently attested to in two of the earliest Christian documents. But because the parable's language is so heavily influenced by the King James Version, words like leaven and 3 measures remain difficult for most of us to understand. Most translators don't know what to do with the idea that the woman hid the leaven in the dough because the Greek does not seem to make sense here. So they have the woman either mixing or kneading, K-N-E-A-D-I-N-G, kneading the dough, which makes more sense to us. And as for 3 measures, a modern listener may also miss the significance here, even though that's a very large amount of flour, about 50 pounds. To the ancient listener, however, the connotation would have been obvious and unmistakable. A first-century Jew would hear an echo of the words of Genesis 18, 1-8, when Abraham's 3 visitors are provided hospitality, and he went to the tent and said to Sarah, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Now these 3 angels, one of whom is Yahweh, come as part of the prophecy of the birth of Isaac, an idea so fantastic that it made Sarah do what? Laugh. She laughed. So when their impossible child was born, they named him Laughter, which in Hebrew is pronounced Isaac. So, this is a parable that recalls the improbable, if not the impossible, and to make it more subversive, the agent is a woman. The agent is a woman who hides the leaven, so it's a subversive act of love by a powerless person. Well, we think there still doesn't seem to be anything all that radical about a woman baking bread. That's what women did in those days. They baked bread. They still bake bread. But as a symbol of the sacred activity of God, it's highly problematic. Indeed, it would have been a scandal. What's more, the Greek words used for hiding or concealed is crypto in Luke or encrypto in Matthew. Both have negative connotations. These are the root words from which we get our English word encrypt, known to all of us computer users as the verb form of our word encryption, or to keep secret by means of a code. It's how we send information we wish to protect. The more important the information, the more important it becomes to protect or secure it, in short, to hide it. When we encrypt things, we are hiding them. The phrase, "until it was all leavened," speaks of the process by which leaven works on dough until everything is corrupted. Once set in motion, the outcome is both inevitable and irresistible. But why would scholars refer to this process as corruption? I mean, that word has negative connotations in English, but isn't a large quantity of bread quietly rising to feed a hungry world a good thing? To our ears it is, but we are not first-century Jews. In the ancient world, the process of leavening frequently stood as a metaphor for moral corruption. The Jews, after all, did not celebrate the feast of the leavened bread, but the feast of the unleavened bread. In their defining event, the children of Israel escaped Egypt by taking their dough before it was leavened. To celebrate Passover, Moses gives very specific instructions about who can partake of the feast of the unleavened bread, and he forbids the eating of leavened bread. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen with you, and no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory. In short, all leavened bread had to be cleaned out of the house. Now, leaven makes bread rise, of course, but also makes it rot. It makes it swell, just as a corpse swells due to fermentation. That's one reason why in the New Testament corpses were such powerful sources of impurity. Hence the negative power of Jesus calling some Pharisees unmarked graves that people walk over without realizing it. Now, if you're looking for a little scriptural evidence that leaven has negative connotations in the New Testament, I've compiled a few brief texts. I came out of the non-instrumental Church of Christ when I was a kid, and we had to prove everything with the text. So here you go. Jesus warns the disciples concerning the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. This is Mark 8:15. They just asked Jesus for a sign, a miracle, which he refuses to do, and such a request corrupts the whole enterprise. Matthew refers to the leaven of the Pharisees as their teaching, while for Luke it is their hypocrisy. Paul twice quotes the proverb, "A little leaven leavens the whole lump." Once in Galatians to warn against a person who's demanding that they be circumcised, and again in his first letter to the Corinthians when he refers to the, quote, leaven of malice and evil, and contrasts it to the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So, I think we get it. Leaven had serious negative connotations at the time Jesus spoke that little parable. Leaven is what those of us who study rhetoric, and that was my PhD work, was in rhetoric. We call this a trigger word, a word which almost guarantees an immediate, predictable response from the audience. So, for example, in our time in America, we can assume a negative reaction among a liberal, progressive crowd to the phrase military-industrial complex, boo, or corporate lobbyists, boo, or Donald Trump, mega boo. Among a more conservative crowd, however, the trigger words are different, right? Tax and spend, boo. Big government, boo. Or that dreaded word, socialism. Megaboo. Now, come to think of it, I think Donald Trump actually works here also, because he, I think, is offending as many conservatives as liberals, so we've never seen anything quite like him. So here's another helpful analogy. Most of us in the United States have heard this proverb, one rotten apple spoils the whole barrel. Have you heard that? That may come the closest to explaining how a first century Jewish audience would have heard the word leaven. Today we might speak of a virus, either the kind that affects the body or one's computer, but the effect of a virus is still negative, out of all proportion to size, and once it begins, it can't be stopped. So, what appears at first to be a harmless little parable is in fact a scandalous one. Understood in its original context, it captures the essence of what I believe must be a movement to return the church to its subversive roots, corrupting, if you will, what is corrupt in the world. What this woman is doing, hiding this leaven, is a model for what the church ought to be doing. We should be neither dissuaded by the odds nor naive about how long it's going to take before the corruption is complete. Our job in the beloved community is to take action against the odds, to resist the forces of death and indignity that are served up daily by the empire by hiding the corrupting agent of love in the loaf of that empire. By hiding this subversive love. And once the process gets started, the empire won't know what's infected it until it's too late. And we can trust that we don't have to finish what we start. We just trust that our love is infectious and can start a process both irresistible and powerful out of all proportion to size. Now, you will know that you are beginning to corrupt the empire when the empire starts pushing back, feels that it has this virus gnawing at it, and starts to inoculate itself against your non-compliance by trying to cut you out, label you as un-American, un-Australian, un-British, whatever, heretical, even maybe, as Bernie Sanders was called, unelectable. Yes, they don't want Bernie Sanders elected, so he becomes unelectable. This is how the empire does chemo. Much empire chemo is done with 24-hour cable news networks. It is perhaps one of the great ironies of our time that you exported Rupert Murdoch to us. We would like for him to come back, have his visa expire or something, come back here. Because you don't want him either. You see, Herod the Fox now has a network named after him. Now, granted, you may never have considered ministry to be even remotely similar to corruption, but stay with me. And I know the whole idea of fermentation's a little creepy to some people, but that's how we get beer and wine, right? And Ben Franklin said beer is proof that God loves us. So, not all forms of rot are rotten. Moldy bread, after all, gave us what? Penicillin. And if you're a gardener, like my wife Shawn, you know the value of compost. Let me tell you, my friends, if I'm caught in the kitchen at home throwing away any organic material, coffee grounds, banana peels, I try to slip them in the trash. Robin. It all goes into the compost pile, she says. Let the fermentation begin. Now, odd as it may sound, I think the church is really often too clean, too antiseptic, too well-appointed, too much like a suburban McMansion with a big cross. Older people seem to respect it. Most young people choose to ignore it, but no one considers the church in our time to be a threat to anyone in power. We are a threat to each other as we continue arguing over who has the correct doctrine or recites the right creeds, but as we busy ourselves with church debates over such weighty matters as, should the kids be able to eat pizza in the parlor? What if they drop one of those little pepperonis on the new carpet? Or what shade of white to paint the sanctuary? There's lots of different shades of white. You know, you need a committee. While we're doing that, real people in the real world, right outside our door, are starving to death. So let me ask you this. When was the last time that you saw the church significantly challenge the status quo instead of just defending it? In my lifetime in America, it was during the Civil Rights Movement. Of course, we still pass lots of resolutions at our national meetings to condemn all manner of evil, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia. But what happens to those resolutions after the vote's taken at the national meeting and the pastors return to their local churches that are just struggling to survive? One of my UCC colleagues recently described us as a church that was once revolutionary, but now she said we are just resolutionary. And here's the thing, the empire does not mind our pronouncements. They don't mind our hand-wringing, our social media campaigns, as long as they do not interfere with commerce or invert the power structure. They know that in the end, righteous indignation without direct action is a bargain. Let me say that again. The empire knows that in the end, righteous indignation without direct action is a bargain. They know we need to blow off steam. It proves that we live in a free country and that democracy works. Then they can return to business as usual, and for the empire, business as usual, that is the good news. In the underground church, however, we have good news that comes in the form of bad news. It is good news to all those who've been left out, but it is bad news to all those who've designed the world around a closed table. For starters, we need to work on our language, replacing the word faith in our worship liturgies more often with the word trust. Trust in God. Faith is hopelessly tied up with belief systems, but the word trust in English implies leaning in to what we imagine is possible, even without the self-righteousness of certainty. And when we finish reading from the Bible in worship, instead of saying, "This is the word of the Lord," when we may in fact have just been reading some really awful text about God sending bears to maul the boys who mocked the prophet of God, or ordered Joshua to commit holy genocide, it's a little unsavory to say, "This is the word of the Lord." We might consider saying instead, "These are our sacred stories. Grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation." We need to ban phrases in the church that are intellectually satisfying but existentially impotent. I don't want to hear any more about paradigm shifts. I'm just so tired of that. I want the church to be one, and let's not confuse ministry with hyper-individualistic navel-gazing. There is a thin line sometimes between spiritual practice and self-absorption. We know this. God is not our personal trainer or a cosmic life coach. And the prosperity gospel, it's very strong in the United States, southern United States, where God helps you get rich. That's a complete aberration. It is the anti-gospel. I'm fond of saying in my own sermons that in the church we talk a lot about the good news, but I think we need to bring back the bad news that the good news implies. And I don't mean by this scaring people with hellfire or making them feel worthless as damaged goods of original sin. I'm not talking about that. There is fear-mongering in religion. I'm not talking about that at all. Rather, I mean to suggest that the gospel cannot be neutral energy. It is not sort of indefinitely malleable like Play-Doh. The gospel has an inherent politic. It's not partisan politics, it's the politics of the gospel. God is neither a Republican nor a Democrat, which is an absurd idea anyway. God is a householder who wants everyone in the house to have enough. Now, just consider the way we tell the annual Christmas story. We love the poetry of it, of course, but who thinks of the Christmas pageant as subversive, dangerous? The nativity as a kind of spiritual apocalypse. Just once, because I'm twisted this way, I would like some subversive Christian education director just to rearrange a few of the lines in our annual children's Christmas pageant. So with apologies to the writer of Luke's gospel, here's what I'd like to hear just once. Be afraid, be very afraid, for behold, I bring most of you bad news of a deep sadness that will come over many very important and powerful people. For to you this day is born a subversive Savior who will be leaven in the loaf of the empire. A teenage mother has hidden this yeast in the midst of scandal and obscurity. By the time you find out, it will be too late, and you will one day wake up to find yourself surrounded by 3 measures of God's corruption. I'm always just rewriting the Bible. On my tombstone when I die, it's going to say, Robin Myers, he paraphrased the Bible. But anyway, I just like to do it because I'm a preacher and the language gets tired against our ear. So let's just go on and get even crazier and do the same thing with Matthew's gospel to see if we can make it a little more real. When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all his minions pretended to be. So he called an emergency meeting of his hand-picked executive board and ordered up some intel on the exact location of the birthplace of the future leader of Occupy Palestine. This row is really enjoying this. Then he sent SEAL Team 6 to Bethlehem on a mission to pay homage. In fact, that was the name of the mission, Operation Homage, which sounds better than Torch the Manger. But lo and behold, somewhere between the palace and the site of Mary, huddled in bloody rags, the men defected. And to this day, there's a bounty on their heads. Herod was heard to mutter, left for their own country by another road, my ass. You can do this. This is fun. Now imagine what the audience might do. People might put down their cell phones and their camcorders and saying how cute the kitties are and say, what version was that? Or consider what might happen to an Easter sermon if the preacher announced not good news, but very frightening news. I bring you this day. Just once in church, I have a fantasy some preacher will have the nerve to say on Easter morning, not, he is risen, but, oh no, he's back. What I am saying is that the church is dying because it seems to have run out of its own surprises. At its best, the church should be a kind of spiritual counterinsurgency. So let's return to the parable of the leaven one last time and consider the Greek word that translates kingdom of God. It is basileia, from which we get the English word basilica, which was the Roman word for a very large public building. And in the ancient world, the basileia had to do with royal administration. So the basileia essentially stands as a symbol of the Roman Empire itself. And to say the very least, such rule was not benevolent. It was the Pax Romana, of course, the peace of Rome. That was the great gift of Augustus to his people. But as you all know, it was only Pax if you were Romana. Otherwise, it was oppressio, oppression. So one more time, let's get our minds around that apparently harmless parable of the underground church. I think it means something like this. The empire of God is like moral corruption that a woman took and concealed, she acts subversively, in 3 measures of flour, an amount so large as to signify an event as significant as the birth of Isaac, until it was all leavened. Now, see, they're coming for us already. And that is, until there's enough for everyone. She begins the process by which distributive justice will one day be realized and the messianic banquet will be served. Just get your minds around this idea. Enough for everyone. This is why the church must not be just a community of care and compassion. That's good, and it should be, but it should also be a community of non-compliance with the principalities and the powers. It must be subversive for the cause of love, a community that resists, pushes back, sometimes in a way almost hidden, until more and more of the imperial loaf is leavened. When people ask me, where'd you come up with the title, The Underground Church? The truth is I borrowed it from the American phenomenon of the 19th century called the Underground Railroad. You all have heard of this. It was that vast network of people that helped fugitive slaves escape to the north and to Canada before the Emancipation Proclamation. That was the church being subversive by doing what was right even before it was legal. Which is why in my church we married same-sex couples for years before we could give them an actual license. In the 19th century, one prominent church in Brooklyn, Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims, whose pastor was also America's most famous preacher of the time, Henry Ward Beecher, had a trap door installed in the sanctuary where slaves who had escaped and made it to Brooklyn on the Underground Railroad could be brought up onto the chancel in the middle of the worship service and then auctioned off to the highest bidder willing to purchase their freedom. That, my friends, is the underground church. What sets it apart from the hyper-polemical time in which we live, where the world's divided into winners and losers, the underground church movement does not insist that everyone have exactly the same theological orientation, or worship in exactly the same style, or listen to the same music, or even be of one political persuasion. In the underground church, there's only one pledge you must adopt to be an underground church, and it's simple. A disciple of Jesus is someone who is more interested in being loving than in being right. Now I'm going to brag for a minute about my own congregation. I've been there 30 years, which is just a crazy amount of time to start with. That's a whole nother lecture. But I want to tell you some things we do. We're not huge, 750 members. 60 when I got there, 750 now, but I'm telling you, Mayflower folk are like leaven in Oklahoma City. They are part of a new community organizing effort in Oklahoma City called Voice. And by the way, the church needs to get involved in community organizing. Voice for us stands for Voices Organized in Civic Engagement. And you know what we do? On the Saul Alinsky model of community organizing, we go out and we have listening parties. We listen to people in the community to see what they're worried about, really. Strangely, despite what we often hear in the American media, the top 3 things people are worried about is not abortion, gay marriage, and gun control, but rather quality education, good public transportation, and access to affordable health care. So Mayflower started a before-school art program in one of our city's poorest public schools. What we found out is the kids got dropped off at Taft Middle School an hour and a half before their first class, so they just ran around, got in trouble. So we hired an art teacher, got a room, invited those kids in off the street to sculpt and paint instead of getting into trouble. We have dozens of reading tutors at Mayflower who meet weekly with students in the inner city who are not reading at grade level, and we read with them for a couple of hours. It's called Whiz Kids. It's a great program. Mayflower feeds 600 homeless people a month and provides them with all the essential supplies needed by people who live on the street. That is clothing, underwear, toiletries, coats, blankets, and for their kids, school supplies, backpacks, you name it. We call it the 363 group because that's the number of days besides Thanksgiving and Christmas when people are in need. 363 days. And at Christmas time, we give our homeless friends these hand-knitted scarves, hundreds of them that have been knitted by men and women in our church who sit up in the balcony and do the knitting in the sanctuary during the Advent worship services. It's really quite a sight to be preaching and look up there and there's all these people knitting. Some people say, does that bother you? I said, no, if it's a bad sermon, at least something good is getting done. And then you should see those scarves get draped around the necks of homeless people and watch them stand up. And we say, that looks good on you. Thank you. Can I have one for my friend? Yes, what color would he look good in? Would she look good in? It's just a little thing. It's just leaven. And here's how we avoid the argument that we don't have enough money to do missions if we want to keep the church lights on. Our premise, fundamental premise, is that if we're not doing mission, there's no reason to keep the lights on. So at Mayflower, all of our missions are self-funded. Now this is intriguing to lay people and a little bit scary to pastors, but that's okay. None of the money for any of these projects comes out of our church's operating budget. You make a pledge to support the operation of the church, and then out of your pocket, you pay extra for the mission of your choice, the thing that you're passionate about, and it works. We raise more money that way. 15 years ago, Mayflower established a remarkable and life-changing mission in the tiny mountain town of Jinotega, Nicaragua, where we staff and we maintain a year-round medical clinic. Mayflower Medical Outreach, it's called. It's a clinic and boarding school to help correct hearing loss in children, some of whom have been abandoned in the market by parents who can't afford to raise a deaf child. They come to us without the ability to speak. They lack the most basic social skills. Some have never brushed their teeth or flushed a toilet or seen a toilet. They come to live in a boarding school that we built and remodeled with sweat equity, members of our church who go down 3 or 4 times a year so they can learn sign language and what it means to be a human being. 10 years ago, we bought this big house. We converted it into the Albergue Mayflower, literally the Inn of Mayflower, where we're trying to practice the ancient Christian principle of radical hospitality. Now, this is a $150,000 a year operation, all paid for in addition to church pledging by members and non-members. Doctors and nurses come from all over the country, and they pay as well. We do ear surgeries. We have an on-site manager who speaks fluent Spanish and lives there year-round. We employ a staff of teachers, counselors, and kitchen staff. We've opened a bakery next door run by locals. The rent from the bakery supports the boarding school. And then we bring the bread home and serve it on the communion table. And that's very important to our congregation. If you ever go to Jinotega, Nicaragua, I don't know why you would, but if you ever did, it's about an hour north of Managua, you will see the word Mayflower all over this little town. And if you ask anyone about the Mayflower, they will say, yes, the church, Estados Unidos, our friends in Oklahoma. Again, this costs $150,000 a year, all of it paid for by people who love the mission. We don't tell people at Mayflower what missions they should want to do. We just say, find it. So they look at the 3-ring circus, that is our mission program, and they try to figure out which one of those rings they might want to jump into, or maybe they start a 4th ring, and we turn them loose. It's all bottom up, it's all lay driven. In that sense, it is very congregational, and we don't have to go to a bishop or run very many things through a committee. For God so loved the world that he did not send a committee. Now, of course, we are still human beings, so each group tends to think, well, our project is the most Jesus-like. It is the best mission, of course. Don't you think, Robin? And I tell each group, yes. Now, here are 2 abiding gospel truths I've learned by being a pastor. Number 1, all families are dysfunctional. Some more than others, but they're all dysfunctional. Number 2, all human beings are deeply insecure, even and especially very accomplished human beings. But all of us want to know that we count for something, that we're worthy, and to be encouraged in what we're trying to do to make the world a better place. So one of the ways the church can distinguish itself from the dominant culture, where it's every man or woman for him or herself, is to be a community of encouragement. Let people know we appreciate them. We think about them. We remember them when they're passing through difficult times. That is, after all, what all of us want and need, to know that we live in one another's hearts. I'm going to hazard a guess after 30 years of parish ministry that most people don't come to church looking for some kind of implausible cosmic bargain, but people do still come. and they're still hungry. Not for all the answers. We don't have all the answers. And not to be inoculated against misfortune. We cannot protect you. But rather to be exposed to the highly contagious notion that either all of us matter or none of us do. It's remarkable to me in the church of all institutions that there's so much resistance to change. Every pastor knows the 7 last words of the church. We've never done it that way before. And yet, the beloved community of Jesus followers was born doing things that had never been done before. And if I've learned anything as a minister, it's that most of the good that happens in church happens when people move toward the mystery we call God without knowing how it's going to turn out. And most of the bad that happens when people move away from that mystery, immobilized by fear and mistrust. The underground church is going to be led by pastors who preach subversive sermons like the ones that are preached here, and who are beholden to no one and to nothing save the truth spoken in love. A woman in my church recently dared me to preach an Easter sermon from the parable of the leaven. I thought, that's not an Easter text. She said, I dare you. Well, she knew that dared to preach a sermon on any text, I would take her up on it. I'm pretty certain there's never been an Easter sermon preached from the parable of the leaven in the history of Christendom. But I thought, I don't think this is going to be hard at all. It turned out not to be hard. So I thought about the fact that empires are really in the body removal business. Rome knew that if you had a problem with some body, all you had to do was get rid of the body. Especially if it was what we call today a high-value target. Make sure he's dead. In the case of Jesus, the story says, run a spear through his side, then put him in a big tomb, seal it with a big rock, post guards there all night long, or heaven forbid, some other body will steal the body, and we'll have a cult of the risen body on our hands. Thanks to the work of historical Jesus scholars, we know that by the time the church got around to writing that story, he'd been dead for a long time, but apparently not to his followers. A movement had begun to rise, almost immediately, fermenting in the loaf of the forgotten. It was nothing short of a scandal, these unclean people worshiping this unclean God. And not surprisingly, women had been the first to take action against the odds, claiming that the tomb was empty and the risen Christ was now leaven in the loaf of his followers. Of course, the response was predictable. Yes, you know, women, they get hysterical. Still, they refused to believe that every last ounce of leaven had been cleaned out of God's household, and strange as it may sound, the followers of the Way, as the underground Jesus movement was first referred to, had in fact initiated the reign of the unclean God, moving from religion as purity to religion as compassionate action among the unclean. So, what was flat and dead had begun to rise, and yet this seemed so improbable and counterintuitive that they wisely kept it hidden, sharing the news of the corruption with only a few. So in the original ending of Mark's gospel, the real ending, the women have it exactly right. They fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Last word of the very first gospel ever written. At Pentecost, the theme of corruption continues. Devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem under the influence of such dramatic fermentation that some of the unleavened people around them accused them of acting under the influence of fermented grapes at 9 o'clock in the morning. I wonder, so now, have we taken all the danger out of Easter? Perhaps in the underground church, instead of just placing an exclamation mark at the end of every sentence in the Easter bulletin, we should at least respect the risks that follow, that's a clergy joke, that follow from exposure to resurrection as a kind of virus. So, when was the last time you heard an invitation to Easter services include like a warning to those who might attend, like a food label or something about one's tolerance for corruption or spiritual fermentation. Don't come if you think you're susceptible to this. It's a secret underground meeting, and we're going to make plans to help rot the empire from within. Now, I'd go to that church. So to wrap this up and get to your questions, here's just a few ways I believe the underground church should begin its corruption. First, in the underground church, I think we should consider fundamental changes to the way we serve communion. Now we only serve it to those in attendance, and in some cases only to those who believe the right things. So we've kind of diminished the sacred meal, the Eucharist, down to a kind of confirming ritual, like an insider's morsel for an insider's blessing. But once it was not this way. Once the Jesus people did food first, and not in symbolic form, not these little bitty things, but on a table heaped high with the riches people had brought to the service. It was a replication of the story of the loaves and the fishes, a story that appears no fewer than six times in the gospel, the most often told story, by the way. Jesus prays to heaven to bless the food, and by so doing, he pays tribute to the divine source of the food he offered, symbolically standing against the Roman Empire. It's important that we remember food has always been used by those in power as a weapon. The emperors maintained their power by distributing bread to the poor, so Jesus feeds the multitudes through a new ethic of sharing, and in so doing replaces Rome as the true source of life. Now, what would that mean in our time? How do we feed people again in our churches as a reminder that food is the basic human sacrament? Take, bless, break, eat. Food always comes first in the beloved community. Second, in the underground church, I think the church has got to become again the center of nonviolent resistance to war in our society. We should proudly embrace the pacifist tradition which refuses to kill, and we should be the one place in modern American or Australian society in which the worship of the warrior, which is rampant in the Western world, the worship of the warrior does not occur. This includes legal and financial help for conscientious objectors and protection for those who wish not to redeploy to the battlefield. Our churches have to become again centers of conscience, helping soldiers who find themselves in a crisis if they decide to lay down their arms. Now, this might get the church in a lot of trouble. One can only hope. Third, the underground church needs to be a place of refuge again for both the stranger, who may be Jesus after all, or the loved one who has no place to lay his or her head. 1 in 4 houses in America is vacant at any given moment. Countless detached garages, garage apartments, and studio apartments could be held open as a place of temporary hospitality. Now, I know there are real issues, safety issues involved here, and some people could not take those risks, but churches should look at buying small apartment complexes that can be places of temporary shelter. I built a studio apartment detached from my house, and all manner of people have lived there, moving through various crises in their lives. My own kids have lived there before they could afford to live on their own. A place of hospitality. Because there's few things as profoundly Christian as to be able to say to someone, I have a place where you can stay tonight. Fourth, in the underground church, I think we need to find ways to create an alternative economy for those who are in covenant with the community. We need to not only redistribute wealth through benevolence giving, we need to seriously consider the ancient Christian practice of loaning money to members of the community at no interest for the purpose of securing shelter, paying medical bills, or escaping the prison of debt. Few things in our time are as shameful as the usury empire of the empire. The credit card, in particular, as master of our lives. The adjustable rate mortgage as a time bomb. The payday loan industry, where you borrow $200, pay back $700. It's like a vulture circling over the desperation of the poor. And if we want to be truly radical, we will seriously consider asking that churches not be completely tax exempt, especially that we pay property taxes, because in America, that's how we fund our public schools. In America, just 6 years ago, 7, I guess now, the financial sector, including Wall Street, bandits, and banks considered too big to fail, caused, as you know, the most severe recession since the Great Depression. Millions suffered, not just in America, but around the world. None of those people responsible for that great debacle went to jail. So instead of just complaining about it, we've got to provide real alternative economies in the church, where our purpose is not to make money, but to share the portable energy that money represents. Now, this might get the church into a lot of trouble. One can only hope. Fifth, in the underground church, our children should be neither out of sight nor out of mind. They should be given visibility and responsibility in the life of the community. We've got to create rites of passage for Protestant youth, not just confirmation or give them a driver's license, but something as significant as bar mitzvah and bar mitzvah in the Jewish tradition and first communion in the Catholic tradition, because every young person in our midst must feel sort of tangled up in the community that cares for them, so that decisions they make have community consequences, not just family repercussions. Sixth, and we're almost done, the underground church has to always support quality public education for the last and the least, and that means adopting a local public school, learning what its needs are, and doing something to help that school. Shocking to walk the hallways of some of America's poorest public schools and confront the sad but simple truth I mentioned last night. We care more about our sports stadiums than we care about our schools. And finally, the underground church must confront the environmental crisis by suspending the argument about what's causing it long enough to take the lead in sustainable practices. From the smallest changes, like less plastic, no styrofoam cups, organic lawn care and gardening, you don't have much of a lawn to worry about here, to driving smaller cars, electric cars, reducing our carbon footprint, having the church be an active recycling center, anything that helps hide a little bit of the leaven of environmental stewardship in the loaf of global climate change. What other institution has the size or the influence greater than the church to practice life in harmony with the natural world? I live in Oklahoma City, a city that created the boom in oil and gas reclamation called hydraulic fracturing or fracking, and it created enormous wealth. But you know, we now have more earthquakes than any place in the world. Little bit of central Oklahoma where I live, 600 earthquakes so far this year, caused by pumping trillions of gallons of chemical-laden water used to break up the rock and extract the oil and gas. They pump it back into the earth, where it is apparently lubricating fault lines and has set off a series of earthquakes we now cannot stop. That is the earth crying out. So, to conclude, this is sort of the credo of the underground church. We were going to print up some little posters that declared churches that would sign off on this to be underground churches. You could put them on your door. The underground church is a movement of the Spirit that regards essential Christian practice as more important than theological uniformity. It acts in all ways and at all times as a community dedicated to the ultimate wisdom that is unconditional love. Beyond our differences, across our differences, in spite of our differences, to be a follower of Jesus, not just a believer in Christ, we must act at all times and toward all people as if we care more about being loving than about being right. This, I believe, to be the credo of the future of the church, if there is one. You are called to be leaven, my friends, a corrupting force for love, a subversive force for justice, and all you have to do is hide a small pinch of that loaf, of that love in the loaf of this broken world, and trust the power of the unfolding mystery that might one day bring us the reign of God. And you know what will be the case on that day when the reign of God arrives? It will be very simple. There will be enough for everyone. And you know what happens when there's enough for everyone? The angels sing. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Robin, for that reflection and for the challenges that are implicit in it for all of us. We're going to begin our time of response to Robin's presentation with a response from the Reverend Rhonda White, and then we'll go into a time when any of you can ask questions. Then we'll have morning tea or cup of tea or coffee, and then there'll be an opportunity to gather in a group. Yes, question. Are you okay with that? Well, is everyone, do I have a, let's do a Uniting Church thing. Raise your hand if you're okay with that. Okay, right. Well, it looks like we'll have 1 minute of silence because there wasn't a huge level of support for that. So that's very Uniting Church too. So just take a moment. Okay. Thank you for that suggestion. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Rhonda White. We thought it was really important to connect with some of the other theological institutions of our community as we planned this weekend. And so we're delighted that Rhonda, who is a lecturer in practical theology and teaches pastoral theology at United Theological College, which is connected to Charles Sturt University, be able to speak to us. Rhonda has had experience in 4 congregational settings, so she is grounded in the life of the church. And this is now her second time working at UTC. Previously, she had other roles, but also connected to practical theology. She is responsible for teaching and overseeing the pastoral theology program, including curriculum development, and her own DMin dissertation was titled Integrating Theory and Practice in Ministerial Education, and it included reflections on learning and community and the idea of an integration journal, which is still an important part of theological education and practice at UTC and at other schools. So Rhonda, we're really grateful that you were with us today and look forward to your response. And then after that, you will all have an opportunity to ask your questions. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Rhonda.
Well, thank you. You've done your homework. I didn't know that about me. And thank you, Dr. Myers. I had the opportunity to read your paper a few days ago, and your passion was evident in your words, but seeing you embody that passion is a real treat. So thank you so much. It's kind of been a little bit of frustration for me because part of the curriculum development, I've been writing new courses, and I'm 5 minutes ahead of my classes most of the time. Don't tell them that. And I had just finished a module on social justice in our Contemporary Issues in Practical Theology master's course. And the social justice module was really focusing on the early church as a social disruptor and trying to recapture some of that. And now I want to put the parable of the leaven back, so I want to recall that module and see if I can rework it. So thank you. You have given us so much to process, highlighted so many gaps in our practices, and I think challenged us with what it might mean for us to live as followers of Jesus as opposed to good church members. I am both fascinated and perplexed with the disconnect between what we do in church as opposed to when we are church, participating in the way of Jesus. Even though in some sense in this gathering I think you're preaching to the choir, I suspect that that might be the case, but many of us still sit through and participate in this strange disconnect. Not here at Pitt Street, of course, and not in all churches, but in enough. And I guess this is part of my attraction to your reclaiming of subversion and corruption, because I sense it has already begun. And perhaps I should say begun anew, even here in Australia. Yes, the history of the church has some wonderful examples of faithful people subverting the norms of the day. The abolition of slavery, the emancipation of women, although I have to say those things still are an issue in our world, and not to mention the Protestant Reformation. But history also provides us with disastrous examples of arrogance, ignorance, greed, and abuse of power, and sadly that is also not history. As difficult as it is to witness and participate in the deterioration of parts of the church, it is also, if I am thoughtful, an exciting and an exhilarating time, because slowly, but definitely surely, some followers of Jesus, small groups, a few isolated people, and some whole congregations are finding their voice and embracing the example of the early church as being disruptors of systems that work against the values of Jesus, of inclusion, healing, justice and love. You have captured my imagination, which is sometimes a dangerous thing, I think, with the bringing alive of that image of yeast in the dough. And in my imagination, how much work that woman had to do to put the yeast and knead the dough of 3 measures, 50 pounds. I tried to do the conversion and I can't remember. It's about 27 kilos. Would that be right? No, someone will correct me, I'm sure. And of course, you've reminded us of the importance of listening to the biblical text with the ears of another, to check for the sentimentality that for many of us is deeply embedded, and to uncover the scandal of the participation of women, the disruption of the status quo, with serious and scholarly Bible study. We do have examples of leaven planting here in Australia. The idea of hiding the corrupting agent of love is, I think, precisely what underpins the actions of those brave individuals who participate in Love Makes a Way. The ecumenical leaders who gather together and occupy the offices of members of Parliament, peacefully praying for and singing, I understand, for the release of refugee children in detention, sometimes being arrested for their efforts, all the while hiding the seeds of the corrupting agent of love, spread by the media coverage, which has pretty much now disappeared. I don't know if you've noticed, but we don't see that so much anymore. When the main TV channels have stopped broadcasting, though, social media keeps it going. But as you said, that isn't all that disrupting to the empire. But what is sitting in the pews, the furrowed brows of the people who are perplexed by the moral question around clergy being arrested. That's where I see it happening, that wrestling with how is this okay? The yeast begins to warm. Ever so slowly, communities of faith begin to wrestle with the possibility that God might be at work in places other than the church. Yeast, it seems, takes its time. but there remains so many places to infect. A beloved community of resistance, I suspect, could have a great appeal to the Australian psyche. Perhaps not necessarily church people, but a nation of displaced peoples. That's who we are. I wonder if our common ground might be found in the submersive message of Jesus and the subversive behaviour of those early followers. Holding in tension a community of care and compassion as well as non-compliance does take some unpacking, and that's a task to be done. So I hope you get access. Will everyone get access to the text? Great, because there's so much in this text. It is unpacking worth doing. So in practical theology, we take as our unique starting point the gaps between what we believe and what we do. We do this both as individuals, but also corporately. And the focus in part of what I'm teaching is to get out of ourselves and to think about what we do as groups of people, as communities of faith. And underpinning the models of practical theology is the acceptance that belief must change. Because what we believe is often a framework that we construct to make sense of God's revelation to us. And that trust, I think, is actually a really handy word to start developing. The thing that happens to us, though, is when we actually start to listen to other people's different constructions, more of God is revealed. And so we continue the process of construction and reconstruction. We need belief. We need to make sense of God's presence in our lives. But we also need to be willing to reconstruct as we listen and explore together, especially those gaps between belief and practice. I suspect that in the tension of communities of care and compassion and non-compliance, or the gap between these things, that here we will find the hidden yeast, the corrupting agent of love. And it will not be found initially in the classroom or the synod or the diocese. It will be found in the communities of those faithfully seeking the way of Jesus. It's a grassroots movement of the Spirit, opening eyes to possibilities, loosening tongues to speak out. The classroom, the synod, the diocese will be infected by those who have learned to hide the yeast in the gaps between belief and practice. The other day I was giving a lecture to my undergraduate ministry class. The topic of the day was governance and administration. It was a wonder that any of them actually turned up, but they did. And I watched them, and I wasn't meaning to bore them, but I watched them as they physically slumped under the weight of the responsibility of all of the regulations and the rules, the workplace health and safety, human resource regulations, all with the power to stifle creativity, new life and possibility. And I watched them sink deeper into their chairs as they realised the responsibility around ministry. But then I asked them to engage with this material with a pastoral heart, to attend to the gap between keeping things ordered and trying something new, to be encouragers of those who see needs in the community and to respond, not by throwing them a risk assessment form, but by providing them with protective support. Not to stifle, but to give life. You are so right. It is, as an institution, we get caught up in the need to be right, to be ordered, to be obedient. And the good girl side of me says, yes, those things are all really important. But the early church were disruptors of society. They were also disruptors of the temple. You have given us 7 possibilities for disruption or yeast hiding, and there's a whole stack more, I know. Worship practices, our politics, relationships, our identity, our children, economics and ecology. And they all share the same principle: to examine what we do against the values of Jesus rather than the values of society. To subvert where necessary with the corrupting agent of love, and to circumvent what seems to be our innate desire for comfort and stability, neither of which were part of the way of Jesus. So thank you again for reminding us of Jesus' call to us to be leaven, for challenging us to take hold of the subversive nature of that call, and to keep hiding the corrupting agent of love in as many places as we see opportunity. And thank you for reminding us of the patience and trust in the mystery of God as we participate in the unfolding of God's reign. We have been blessed by your passion, your wisdom, and your experience. Thank you.